It's not uncommon for warships to have a battle flag to show off their accomplishments. An interesting story presents itself when viewing the battle flag of the USS Barb, a submarine from World War II. It has a standard flag accoutrement, its logo, its name, flags of various types to denote differing varieties of kills. But what's that at the bottom center of the flag? It looks like a train. Surely a submarine couldn't take out a train, right? They don't even operate in the same fluids. Well, sure enough, the crew of the USS Barb did actually manage to blow up a train, and in the process became the only Allied soldiers to invade mainland Japan in World War II. Let's take a look at the history of the USS Barb, the sub that blew up, amongst other things, a train. Before I begin speaking about the USS Barb, I should point out that there are often conflicts amongst sources as to her accomplishments. There were disputed sinkings where one source did not give her credit, but other sources did. I tried to sort through the disputes and come up with the most accurate history I could for the Barb. Things have a tendency to get confused in the fog of war, and if the people who study this for a living can't come to a consensus, I may present some information that's not entirely accurate based off one or more sources. I will provide the sources I used in the description in order to account for any discrepancies with actual history. The USS Barb was commissioned into the United States Navy on July 8, 1942. She patrolled the Mediterranean from October 20th through November 25th of 1942 as support for Operation Torch, which was the Allies' initial landing in North Africa. On her second patrol, she damaged a Spanish tanker believed by the Barb's commanding officer at the time, Lieutenant Commander John Waterman, to be under Axis control. The ship didn't sink, but that didn't stop the Barb's crew from putting a Nazi flag on their ship's battle flag. In the spring of 1943, she was moved to the Pacific Theater. Her first 4 patrols in the Pacific didn't net any action. Those would be the last patrols of the Barb during the war, where she came up empty-handed, as starting with her 7th patrol in the beginning of March of 1944, she was credited with at least one ship, and most of the time multiple ships, on every patrol she undertook until the end of the conflict. On her 7th patrol, she got her first confirmed kill, sinking the Japanese cargo ship Fukushi Maru in the shipping lanes between the Marianas Islands and Formosa, or modern-day Taiwan. The Barb fired 3 torpedoes at the Fukushi, resulting in the freighter being cut in half. On April the 17th, during the same patrol, the Barb joined USS Steelhead in a bombardment of an industrial area on Rasa Island in the Japanese-controlled Philippines. Barb scored several hits, including a phosphate plant, setting off a series of chemical and munitions explosions. This would be her final patrol not under the command of the skipper most closely associated with the USS Barb. She would be retrofitted and sent back out now under the command of her most memorable skipper, Commander Eugene Lucky Flucky, a name I'm sure was never mispronounced as an expletive by inebriated soldiers. Her 8th patrol began on May 21st, 1944, in the Sea of Okhotsk on the northern shore of Japan's Hokkaido Island. 10 days after her patrol began, on May 31st, the Barb spotted a Japanese convoy labeled Convoy NE and fired at the cargo ship Koto Maru. The Barb scored 2 hits with torpedoes on the Koto's front starboard side, resulting in the sinking of the ship. That same day, the Barb found a Japanese Army transport ship, the Madras Maru. The Barb fired 3 torpedoes at the Madras, leading to her being sent to the bottom as well. After a battle on June 2nd resulted in the Barb being forced to retreat from a depth charge attack by an enemy ship, she was back in action on June 11th. The Barb took out 4 ships that day. All of them were various types of fishing vessels. She started by sinking 2 trawlers with her guns, then fired torpedoes at and sank the Toten Maru and the Chihaya Maru. 2 days later, on June the 13th, the Barb encountered the transport vessel Takashima Maru. The Barb fired her final 2 torpedoes at Takashima, hitting and sinking her. The Barb stayed on patrol until July 9th despite not having any torpedoes left to fire. In total, the ship was credited with destroying 15,472 tons of enemy shipping during this one patrol. The Barb's 9th wartime patrol began on August 4th, 1944. She wouldn't be credited with any kills until August 31st, and even that one was disputed. The Barb joined the USS Queenfish and the USS Tunney in the sea lanes between Manila and Hong Kong, where they engaged a large, well-defended convoy. The minesweeper Hinode Maru was sunk, but the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee, also known by the acronym JANIC, didn't credit Barb with the destruction of the ship. Other sources did credit the Barb, however. The Okuni Maru, however, was indisputably downed by the Barb as part of this attack. After the initial onslaught, where the Barb did score hits on a tanker and a freighter, as well as possibly sinking the Hinode Maru, she stalked the convoy for several hours before sending 3 torpedoes into the Okuni. The detonation split the Japanese freighter in 2, sending it below the waves. Barb suffered minor damage getting away from the convoy, but that didn't stop her from sinking a Japanese sampan with gunfire on September 4th. Her next big engagement came on September 16th, 1944, when she would come upon another heavily armed convoy of ships. She would destroy her largest target so far when she took out the tanker Azusa Maru and the 20,000-ton escort carrier Unyo with torpedoes. While this was her last action she saw during her ninth patrol that resulted in enemy ships being downed, she did manage to rescue 14 British and Australian POWs from the shipwreck of a different Japanese vessel others had sunk. Her 10th War Patrol saw her credited with either 2 or 3 enemy ships destroyed, depending on your source. The sinkings occurred over a 6-day span. On November 10th, Barb took out the transport vessel Gokuku Maru in the East China Sea. 2 days later, she encountered and sank the cargo vessel Naruo Maru. 2 days after that, she struck but did not sink the cargo ship Gyokuyo Maru. Gyokuyo limped off for 2 more days before encountering the USS Spadefish, who finished her off. Janik only credits the Spadefish with the kill, but other sources do share the credit between Barb and Spadefish. The results of the Barb's 11th War Patrol are heavily disputed. It began on December 19, 1944. She is credited with 3 1/3 ships sunk. There were 8 other ships during the patrol that the Barb either damaged but didn't sink, might have sunk but weren't credited for, the sinkings couldn't be verified, or the Barb just straight up didn't sink. Among these were an unidentified Japanese naval weather ship, 3 unidentified cargo ships, the Anyo Maru, for which the Barb was originally credited but was later found to have been sunk by the USS Pakuta, the Maiho Maru, which Barb hit but was finished off over 2 months later by aircraft, the Hisagawa Maru, which was found to have been down by aircraft as well, and the Katura Maru. The Katura was later have been found to have been lost by, quote, accidental grounding. And if I were the captain of that ship, I would probably be like, yeah, we were definitely sunk by an American sub. I didn't run my ship aground at all. Why are you asking me about this? As far as what the Barb actually did accomplish on this patrol, she had herself a day on January 8, 1945. She sank the tanker Tatsuyo Maru, and, along with the Pakuta and the Queenfish, chased the tanker Hikojima Maru until it ran itself aground. The ship was declared a total loss on February 12th, and all 3 American ships were given shared credit. Also on that same day, she hit another ship, the tanker Sanyo Maru, who also ran herself aground. Unlike the Hikojima, the Sanyo broke apart the next day. Probably the most cinematic of Barb's kills so far would come on January 23rd. She encountered the ammunition cargo ship Daikyo Maru, whose circumstances of sinking are described as, quote, sunk by torpedo and munitions explosions. But it was the Barb's 12th and final war patrol for which she's best known. The patrol also had a lot of ships for which Janik didn't give the Barb credit, mostly because there were 35 sampans and a trawler listed as disputed, and I'm pretty sure by this point the people at Janik just couldn't be bothered to verify tiny ships when they probably still had capital ships and oil tankers to verify. Oddly enough, there was a ship the Barb sunk on this patrol that the sinking was actually filmed, and they even recovered documents in a small piece of the wreckage. Apparently, no one filmed or recovered the name of the ship, so no one knew what ship to credit the Barb with downing. So it's still uncredited to this day. July 5th saw Barb take down the cargo ship Sapporo Maru. July 18th saw her get a disputed kill of the Seiho Maru, for which she was not credited by Janik. She also bagged the elegantly named Coast Defense Vessel No. 112. This was the last ship she was given credit for sinking during the war. But with all the Barb's success hunting ships, and she was the 4th most successful American submarine in the war by total tonnage, that's not what she's best known for. So finally, we come back to the train on the battle flag that I mentioned during the beginning of the video. So how does a submarine, a vehicle which works very well in the water but extremely poorly on land, blow up a train, a vehicle that works well on the land but very poorly in the water? I'd like to be able to tell you a tale of some James Bond level nonsense where they, I don't know, welded some helicopter rotor blades onto the sub and turned it from a submarine to a supermarine, despite the very high probability that the laws of physics completely disallow that as an option. I'd like to tell you something like that, but that's not what happened. The answer is much more mundane. The USS Barb sent a raiding party into Japan. Commander Flucky and his crew had observed trains near the shoreline of the Japanese island of Karafuto and reasoned that they might be bringing materials to the supply ships the Barb had been hunting. They watched the trains for 3 days to establish the train route schedule. The crew suggested rigging explosives on the track to take the trains out, though Commander Flucky originally resisted the idea. He deemed it too dangerous to commit his crew to. One of his crew, however, Engineman 3rd Class Billy Hatfield, came up with a less dangerous solution. He recalled that as a young boy, he'd placed nuts between the railroad ties under the tracks back home. When trains rolled over the tracks, they'd sag from the weight, and it would crack open the nuts. They devised a plan to rig a micro switch, put it between the ties and under the track, much like the nuts from Hatfield's childhood, and the train would detonate its own bomb. This would allow the crew to be nowhere near when things got all blowy-uppy. Hatfield naturally volunteered to lead the mission. Now, the Barb had already become the first sub to fire ballistic missiles into Japan, because Flucky thought it would be cool to mount a missile launcher to his sub. I can't stress enough how gung-ho this crew was. Honestly, I was joking about them trying to get the sub airborne earlier, but if they'd have thought of it, I think they might have at least considered it. Needless to say, they found no shortage of volunteers to invade Japan and blow up a train. Flucky had criteria, though. First, he wanted volunteers to be unmarried, so if shit went sideways, no widows were left behind. He also wanted a mix of regular Navy and reservists. He wanted every department to be represented. And I do mean every department, but we'll get to that shortly. He also wanted at least half the volunteers to be Boy Scouts. I guess he wanted them to, quote, be prepared if something went wrong. Actually, the real reason was because he knew they would have first aid and survival training. Shortly after midnight on a cloudy July 3rd, 1945, the USS Barb crept within 950 yards of the shore of Karafudo Island, and 8 men disembarked from the ship into small boats. Less than 30 minutes later, the following 8 men became the only U.S. soldiers to invade the Japanese home islands during World War II. Engineman 3rd Class Billy Hatfield, Chief Gunner's Mate Paul G. Saunders, Signalman 2nd Class Francis Neil Sever, Torpedoman's Mate 3rd Class Edward W. Klingsmith, Motor Machinist Mate 2nd Class James E. Richard, Motor Machinist Mate 1st Class John Markison, Lieutenant William M. Walker, and Ship's Cook 1st Class Lawrence W. Newland. That's right, when I said Flucky wanted every department to be represented, I meant every damn department. They sent a cook on the mission. I'm just going to leave these 8 men's name on the screen for a few seconds so we can all bask in the glorious awesomeness, courage, and craziness these men must have possessed to undertake this mission. Despite a couple of minor setbacks, including one of the men attempting to gain a better vantage point by climbing what turned out to be an occupied guard tower with a sleeping sentry, they made it to the tracks undetected. They began digging under the tracks for a place to put the 55 pounds of explosives they brought, but did have to duck into the brush when a train came down the tracks before they had the bomb set. Once that train had passed, they got back to work setting the explosives. Billy Hatfield was tasked with setting the pressure switch, which he successfully accomplished. With the bomb set, it was time for the crew to make their way back to the Barb. The Barb's crew had gotten the boat 350 yards closer to the shore by this point, at about 600 yards. The crew had only spent 90 minutes on Japanese soil before signaling the ship they were returning. 15 minutes of quiet paddling later, they heard a train in the distance. At 1:47 a.m., a 16-car train ran over the tracks above the explosives. The explosion, quote, sent pieces of the engine into the sky like a fireworks display. Flucky, having given up on stealth being an option at this point, grabbed a megaphone and shouted at the crew to, quote, paddle like the devil. 5 minutes after the explosion, the crew were safely back aboard the submarine. Once the ship was a safe distance from the shore, Flucky ordered all non-essential personnel to the deck for the same reason I left the crewmen's names on the screen earlier, to bask in the awesomeness and craziness of what they had just pulled off. The Barb's last patrol of the war ended on August 2nd, 1945, 12 days before the Japanese accepted the Allies' terms for surrender. The Barb and her crew earned the following accomplishments during the war: 6 Navy Crosses, 23 Silver Stars, 23 Bronze Stars, a Medal of Honor, a Presidential Unit Citation, a Navy Unit Citation, the 4th most tonnage sunk of any submarine during the war, 5 Japanese warships damaged or sunk, including the escort carrier Unyo, rocket and gun symbols on her battle flag for her shore bombardments, and the train on her battle flag for blowing up an actual damn train. When Eugene Flucky was asked about which recognition of the Barb he was the fondest of, he responded by saying it was the one medal not on the flag that made him the most proud, the Purple Heart. Despite multiple battles over years of war, and despite invading the homeland of the enemy, not a single member of the Barb's crew was lost or wounded. The Barb would continue to serve until 1947, when she would be decommissioned. She was brought out of retirement in 1951 and served off and on again until 1954. She was then loaned to Italy, where she became the Enrico Tezzoli, until being sold for scrap in 1972. Upon learning of the ship's fate, now Admiral Fluckey stated that if the crew had known about it, they'd have bought the sub and brought it home as a museum ship. And that's the story of the USS Barb, the sub from whom no Japanese vehicle was safe. Except for maybe the aircraft, but if the war went on a little longer, I'm willing to bet there'd be a Mitsubishi Zero on the Barb's battle flag too. They'd have figured it out. If you enjoyed the video, or have complaints about all the Japanese ship names whose pronunciations I'm sure I probably butchered, feel free to like, subscribe, comment on, or share the video. And don't forget to ring the notification bell for more weekly content. Thanks for watching.